All right, I'm excited to talk to you a little bit about our research on use cases for generative AI and workforce development. So, just to give you a little bit of context and background on how we started this work, we saw that there were a lot of resources related to kind of teaching and learning, but not necessarily specifically to workforce development, especially as generative AI was becoming more and more popular. So, our goal was really to understand kind of what are the broad set of use cases that you could use generative AI for and what are the tools that currently exist out there? So obviously that's constantly changing. So this is already out of date, but it at least gives you sort of a sense for where there's market saturation, where there's some gaps too that we can potentially fill. So the first thing that we wanted to do as we were creating this framework is one, just to kind of think about all the wide range of use cases for generative AI. We know that AI is good at taking unstructured data and then turning it into structured data or outputs or content. It's fairly good right now at human-like interactions at scale, and can accomplish some more complex tasks as well. And so content generation, data analysis and insights to some extent, process automation, personalized experiences, design and innovation were all things that we were keeping in mind as we were building out some of these frameworks around the use cases. And so we found, these are some of the common, use cases that we've heard about, but we wanted to go deeper. But, just at a high level, right, I'm sure many of you might have used AI for resume and cover letter building. We heard a lot from career coaches that we talked to. We interviewed a variety of career coaches and folks who work in workforce organizations about the ways in which they're seeing AI, and that's kind of informed these frameworks as well. Secondly, the big area is also AI-powered career coaches, right? How do you get people to have more information about the types of opportunities that might be available to them based on their interests, based on their experiences in a more, seamless way. And then grant writing. So grant writing is another big use case that we heard about of where, folks are being able to generate grant reports based on, specific RFPs, but also within the context of their organizations. And so, you can use general tools, but you can also use some of the specific tools that are starting to come out around these use cases. So, those were the ones that we heard that were fairly common, but we wanted to, again, dive in. So what we did was we created two kind of frameworks around the use cases. One that's more centered on the job seeker journey, and then one that's more about an organization that is supporting job seekers. So what are some of the use cases more from like an operational standpoint? And I'll walk through those in just a minute. So use cases for job seekers. So as you can see, what we built out here is a number of use cases that kind of follow the job seeker's journey here, starting from just finding a career that someone might be interested in, doing a little bit of career exploration, then moving to then what are the skills I might need for that career, and how do I then showcase that in a resume or artifact or some other um, uh, you know, place, and then how do I find a job that I might want to have in the future? How do I land that job? So that includes, preparing for interviews, negotiating offers, tracking all of that. And then ultimately, once a job seeker lands in a job, how might I succeed in that job? What kind of coaching might I receive as well? And then along the bottom, you'll see two cross-cutting categories that we've also added here that just kind of like permeate throughout the job seeker experience. So helping to connect to trusted guidance. So that's really getting at the social capital piece, right? Coaching, relationships with peers or mentors, building community. We know that's really important in this day and age, especially as folks are getting inundated with AI cover letters and resumes. And then, of course, wraparound support services, right? So, how do job seekers actually get access to the supports that they need to actually succeed both during the job seeking process, but also in a job? So, access to financing, financial wellness, healthcare, housing, transportation, etc. So, those are the ways in which we thought that AI could potentially have some use cases in workforce development. And then we would come to the second framework, which is more around the professionals who assist job seekers, right? So again, kind of for organizations and people who are actually supporting that journey, what are ways in which operationally generative AI could play a role around, driving down the time that it might take to support many, many job seekers. So there's a first category of the direct service work that a coach might be doing, right? So you might be recording meeting notes, communicating with job seekers, recommending actions, making sure you're capturing all of that data in whatever kind of platform that you need to be using. And then there's a category that's more around operations, right? So there is this idea of managing organizational knowledge and resources, you know, managing programs, so recruiting program participants, but also tracking outcomes and feedback, coaching case managers to help support in those programs. And then managing partnerships, right? We in workforce development have partnerships maybe with training or education institutions as well as employers. So how do we keep track of all of that, managing those communications, managing some contracts, administrative paperwork, all related to that. And then, of course, the fundraising use case that we've talked about already around finding suitable opportunities, drafting funding applications, managing reporting. And then the last big bucket is the strategic leadership component, right? We want to make sure that generative AI can really support in tracking and showcasing impact, right? How do you track that data? How do you understand the evidence base for your programs to be able to make the right recommendations to job seekers? And then also, how do you showcase those outcomes and impact for funders, for your board, for other external stakeholders to really show how an organization is shining as it relates to supporting job seekers? And then there's also a component of labor market data that generative AI can really support here with, really interpreting labor market trends, breaking jobs down into skills, mapping regional assets. So these are all places that we saw some good use cases and opportunities to leverage the power of generative AI within workforce development. And then, like I said, what we did next is then we wanted to know what's out there because these are more use cases where we thought generative AI could play a role, but we didn't find tools for every single bucket, as you'll see in a second. So this is the market map of a selection of tools that we were able to find in our research so far. So you'll see this is the first framework around the support for the individuals. And you'll see we've called out in kind of the red and the green where there's market saturation, which is the green, and where there's maybe some more opportunities, which is the red. So I'll focus on the saturation first. So no surprise, as we saw and we heard from the qualitative interviews, there are a lot of tools around career navigation and exposure, a lot of tools that are helping job seekers really make sense of what are the jobs I might be interested in, where might I find them. They all do them in slightly different ways, but that's definitely one big one. The second one is the resume and cover letter builders, as we saw. That's becoming very, very popular. It's, a very common use case that we hear, and they're very specific tools, but also general tools, right? You'll see that all of the big frontier lab models like Gemini, OpenAI, Claude are listed here as well because those are also available to use without necessarily needing specific tools like Teal or JobsCon. So those were some areas of saturation in addition to the career navigation coaching, which is pretty related to the career navigation and exposure bucket, which is how our career navigation coaching tools supplementing and hopefully not replacing career coaches to be able to help guide job seekers through a process of really understanding kind of what are their interests, what are their skills, what are the opportunities available for them, and how do they get there. And then now we can turn to some of the opportunity areas. And this is where we just saw fewer tools that kind of exist in the market, as you can see. So, for example, there's a lot of opportunity, I think, in the help me connect to trusted guidance piece. So building relationships with peers, mentors, advocates, that social capital piece. There are a couple of tools here that are trying to work on this, like Climb Together, to help students in particular really learn how to do networking, right? How do you actually reach out to somebody? How do you, like, who are the people that you should talk to? What's the way in which you can pitch yourself? What are the types of messages that might resonate? What's the right level of ask, right? Those are all skills that need to be built and learned that can be enhanced by an AI tool where you can actually practice some of those skills. So a lot of opportunity there. There's also the assess skills and identify gaps. So I think skill assessment generally, there's a lot of work around that, but it's really hard to do. So how can we get better at that? How can generative AI really, and AI generally, really support that work? Um, and then again, related to kind of social capital, but networking, right? How do you continue to build those skills? How do you facilitate introductions and relationships between people as folks are in the job market and looking for opportunities? The other area that we also called out was resource navigation as a gap. There's been some more work in that space since we've published this report, but resource navigation more generally meaning how do you map people to get the right support services at the right time? That's obviously a place that has seen a lot of investment in the past couple of years too, but we had identified as a gap. All right. Then I'm going to move towards the market map for organizations. So again, same kind of frame. We were trying to find what were the tools that are actually out here. If you'll notice, this map looks slightly different. There's some grayed out boxes here. And the reason there are gray boxes is because we found that there are frankly not a lot of tools that are geared specifically towards workforce development organizations. And so where you see gray is where we saw more general purpose tools that are sort of force-fitted and used by workforce organizations or could be used by workforce organizations in their work, but it's not necessarily specific to the needs of an organization that is supporting job seekers. So there's market opportunity here, hopefully. But that's the difference between the blue and the gray boxes. And then when it comes to kind of where there's market saturation, recording meeting notes. So, we're recording this meeting right now and taking notes. Obviously, that is one big use case and can really help relieve some of the routine task of kind of taking notes for a career coach. Secondly, administrative contracts and paperwork. There are a lot of general purpose tools to this effect to really support that process, putting out RFPs, managing contracts, etc. And then drafting funding applications. So in the grants management space, like actually drafting those, but also, you can use the general LLM tools as well. So that's where we really saw a lot of market saturation. Again, notice where the market saturation is where we're actually seeing just more general purpose tools and not necessarily specific for workforce. So there might be still some opportunity there. Lastly, the opportunities that we saw that we didn't see a lot of tools in. Maintaining eligibility and compliance. So we heard a lot from like workforce boards, especially those who have to comply with federal and state legislation and kind of WIO requirements, knowing kind of where a particular individual might be able to be eligible for a particular program based on whatever guidance there is, making that more clear and easier to manage was definitely an opportunity area we saw. Secondly, you'll see in the coach case managers right underneath that, there's aren't any tools we saw there. And what we mean by coach case managers is, we want to make sure that case managers or career coaches are operating at the same level of quality across all of their interactions with job seekers. And so what is the way that you can actually monitor that but also provide the guidance and coaching, leveraging AI. In sales, for example, they use this a lot where you might record a sales call and then you might get some feedback on how that call went. to be able to do better next time, or, items to follow up on. We didn't necessarily see that same application for case managers, especially when we have to be so sensitive to kind of, privacy and security when it comes to talking to job seekers specifically. Um, Next, I'm going to move to the right to the Help Me Track Showcase and Impact column where track outcomes data. So again, that's also a really big pain point for workforce organizations that we heard, right? So once a participant completes a program, do they get a job? What is the wage for that job? What kind of wage increases, hopefully, did we see from that? That's a very manual process at the moment, and being able to track that in a much more seamless way with the power of AI could be really powerful. Where, it's a big pain point. We're not necessarily seeing the right tools yet to be able to fill that gap. And then if we move over one more column over to the map regional assets, again, this is another big pain point in knowing kind of what exists in the world in a particular region. We know that, for example, there are certain training providers, but those might change on a, year-to-year basis. Landscape maps have to be constantly refreshed. Just kind of knowing who's in the ecosystem to be able to support job seekers is also a very manual process, and it's a big pain point and therefore opportunity area for other, technology providers to step in. All right. So that was a lot. We'll link to this so you can dive a lot deeper. The research also gives you kind of a list of all of the tools that we had in here, so you can feel free to download that and peruse that in more detail. But the general, takeaways here are that there's a lot more tools that are really catered towards job seekers and fewer for organizations themselves. So definitely an opportunity there. But before I end, I just wanted to leave you with kind of the future state, right? So that's kind of what exists now, but we want to think about what can happen in the future. This quote that I have here is from Benedict Evans, who's really just talking about, right now we're still focused on understanding how we can really leverage the power of AI within workforce development. So we're also really focused on what the workflows are now and what we're doing now. And how do we start to think about the future and what might shift and what might change because of the power of AI? That's the next step. And so I just leave you with some ideas and food for thought. So, what if AI really facilitated human connection? I mentioned that a lot of the opportunity areas were around, being able to facilitate social capital or networking, right? We don't want to replace any human connection with generative AI, but we want to amplify the ability to connect with others so that in service of, having quality jobs, having quality communities and relationships, and what does that look like in the future? Secondly, how do we use data to really drive equity, right? One of generative AI's strengths is really to have a large amount of data, parse through it, and then be able to take action on it. So how do we do that in a way that can really drive better outcomes for the folks that need it the most? Make pathways more transparent, use inference to understand people's skills in a way that might not have been surfaced before, and really like drive a true skills-based economy. And then lastly, when we think about another use case for AI for the future is how do we just think generally about removing friction from the career navigation process, right? It can be really hard and challenging and even emotional to even just say that you need help or, going to a human. For some people may be difficult in that way. Does AI kind of help to remove some of that friction, remove some of that shame, even we heard about that? What does that look like? But how does that all work together in an ecosystem where we do have, real human coaches who care about people as well as supporting the needs of job seekers? How does that change the ways in which we work? Those are all, real questions that we need to grapple with as we start to get more into, actually implementing some of this.